Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 18. Very cool episode for you this week, one that I would have not been able to do if it weren't for Stephen Cornett of Nature's Always Right, and also episode 8. Why? Because my guest, Jared Smith of Jared's Real Food, has very little online presence, respectfully, but that makes him a little hard to discover. So shout out to Stephen for connecting us, because I think you all are going to love this episode. Jared is doing a lot of cool stuff, including 2.5 acres of vegetable production in lasagna style gardening. Admit it, you didn't think that was a thing. Jared did. Jared does. Jared is making a good living at it. So we get into his methods and talk about profitable, viable permaculture. And it is a great episode. I am super excited to bring it to you. Of course, I couldn't bring it to you without you. Okay, and a couple sponsors, but first you. If you want a second season of the show, we still have to get our Patreon page up to $1,000 a month to afford it. You know, I cannot budget-wise do a second season unless we hit that number. Full stop. The sponsors are awesome. Truly, we have awesome sponsors. And they are helping us to get out of the red for Season 1, but we need help going into Season 2 in the fall. So please, consider signing up. $2 a month, $5, whatever you can afford, whatever the show is worth to you. 50 cents an episode sounds like a pretty sweet deal. That's patreon.com/farmerjesse, patreon.com/farmerjesse, or feel free to Venmo us, Venmo. It's an app on your phone. You can Venmo us a donation at No-Till Growers. That's ampersand, No-Till Growers. Excited to say that this episode is also brought to you by Banner Greenhouses. Banner has been providing USDA-certified organic vegetable and flower plugs since 1991. Their growing area covers over 18 acres and enables Banner to provide optimum growing conditions for each of their cultivars. Banner will source practically any seed that can be used in organics and offers it in 72, 128, and 288 plugs. And I have to say, their transplants are vigorous and beautiful. I've seen them in person. I have seen them in action. We have used them in our garden. I have several in there right as I record this. Jackson and I, my partner in No-Till Growers, actually sought them out specifically as a sponsor because we love their product so much. If you do not yet have a great propagation house, get a great start with Banner. You can learn more about Banner at bannergreenhouses.com. Follow them on Instagram or Facebook, or call 828-659-3335. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by the amazing Growing for Market magazine. For 28 years, Growing for Market has been the source for direct market food and flower growers. All GFM content is custom written for the magazine by farmers like myself and others who get their hands dirty and know what they're talking about. It's all original content. If you do farmers market, CSA, farm stand, pick your own, florist sales, or wholesaling, your business is different from any other kind of farming. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to GFM for all the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of small farming 10 times a year. Available as a paper magazine, digital download, or both. Subscribe to GFM for the latest on market farming. There's information on growing vegetables and flowers in every magazine. Use the coupon code NOTIL, that's lowercase, one word, to get 20% off any subscription through growingformarket.com, or call 800-307-8949. Subscribers always get 20% off the carefully curated selection of market farming books GFM carries. In fact, GFM editor and podcast guest Andrew Mefford's brand new book, The Organic No-Till Farming Revolution, is available for 20% off for the first month in February from growingformarket.com. Interviews with 17 different growers using no-till and an overview of the techniques provide a roadmap for anyone interested in starting a no-till farm or converting an existing one to no or less tillage. That's growingformarket.com, promo code lowercase no-till. Okay, enough from me. Let's get to the interview with Jared Smith of Jared's Real Food. Jared Smith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm super excited to have you on. You came with high praise from Stephen Cornett of Nature's Always Right, and I'm excited to dig into some of what you've got going on there at Jared's Real Food. Maybe we could just start with you giving us kind of an idea of the size of your farm and where you're located, those sorts of things.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm located in San Diego, and specifically I'm in East County, San Diego. The city's called Lakeside, and it's more of a traditional farming town, although it's these days becoming more and more developed like a lot of farming towns are. But basically I had the opportunity to start my farm on family land, and it was my grandpa's old chicken ranch where he used to farm, or he used to raise about 100,000 chickens. And so basically there was a little tiny space there between two of the chicken buildings that I started. And then from there I expanded to a 2-acre lot. And currently I'm in another expansion. So I think in total I'm doing about close to 2.5 acres of production right now. And that's with fruit, vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Just a very diverse farm. A lot of annuals, but definitely doing perennial crops too. It's hard to list them all. I'd say there's probably at this point at least 50 to 70 different varieties that we do at the farm. So yeah, I'd say I usually describe it as like a market garden that's influenced by permaculture. So there's very much a lot of diversity and perennials amongst the annuals. And it's kind of a different thing for people when they first see it. They're expecting like one crop or something, and they're like, whoa, you grow all these things. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. How are you marketing your produce?
So I run a CSA, and that's my main deal. I sell everything individually too, but the main income for the farm is just the weekly CSA customers that come and just buy the bulk bag from me. And normally I have, I think, about 7 or 8 different produce items that I offer in my bags each week.
Nice. And you said they're mostly picking up on your farm?
Yeah, so they either come to my farm, I do farm pickup, and I also do home deliveries. So,
oh, right.
And that's a little more limited. It's more, most of my deliveries are around my area, although now I am expanding a little further as it gets more and more bigger. But yeah, it's probably 50-50. I think a lot of people really like it just having it delivered to their house. And then other people think it's cool to go to the farm and like see me farming out there and like see firsthand where it's coming from. So it's kind of a good mix of both of those.
Nice. Is there a price difference in the delivery versus the farm pickup?
I do, yeah. So I do $27 for the farm pickup, and then if people want it delivered, I add on $3 for, so it's $30 for the delivery, and that's to help me cover gas and the time it takes to deliver, and then the vehicle maintenance and all that kind of stuff. And nobody ever complains about that. Everyone always thinks it's very reasonable, even though these days we're competing with like Amazon Prime and a lot of free shipping style businesses. But I think people understand, coming from a small business, that it really does take an extra effort to cruise around and deliver everything. So yeah, people are willing to do that.
Yeah, that's great. My wife and I, we started doing delivery CSA maybe 2 years ago. We've done it for 2 seasons, really hardcore, and our customers love it. And the things that we feared would happen, that we'd kind of lose that relationship element by just dropping their food off, really haven't happened. We feel as close to our delivery customers as anybody else.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've noticed that too. I mean, some of my delivery customers are some of my most hardcore, buy every week. Like, they always order consistently. So yeah, it's been really good for me too.
Nice. And maybe you said this, but how many CSA customers are you doing all together?
Well, I usually go per week. I have like a big pool of people that are in my mailing group. And so my CSA isn't like a traditional one where I sell shares at the beginning of the year. I basically just go week to week with people, and I have the newsletter, and I just mail out to everyone on my mailing list what the produce is for the week, what I'm going to harvest. And then if people want something, they just reply to that email. And so that email is going out to hundreds of people, but I would say per week I'm probably doing anywhere from like 40 to 60 CSA bags. and then plus side orders and individual items as well.
Okay, so with the individual items and the side orders, does that all kind of come through the website, or are people just emailing you your how does that how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's also through the email, or people can also call, or some of my customers even text me. We're on like a real friendly basis. So if they want a delivery with individual items, I require at least a $20 order. So there's that part of it. But yeah, a lot of people, they just order individual stuff. Like they don't necessarily want the exact CSA bag, so I'm flexible with them, and I'll let them either take the CSA bag and just either substitute certain items that they don't want, or they can take certain ones out. Or people just give me a list altogether of individual stuff that they want. And sometimes that's even more than the CSA bag is. And that's great too. So for me, I've just always, I know it's a little more work for the farmer, but I've always tried to be as flexible as I can, because I know, like when I first started farming, or even before that, when I was involved in CSA programs as a consumer, as a buyer, I know a lot of them were like really rigid, and they wouldn't substitute out any produce. And sometimes maybe you had stuff left over from last week, or it's something you don't really like that much. And so I know just customers really appreciate having more of that flexibility, and they've even mentioned that to me, that they appreciate that. So I think it's been good, although it is a little tricky sometimes with all the side orders, getting everything exactly right. It can be a lot more logistics going on.
Interesting. So do you do that on spreadsheets, or is it more, do you do like tickets? Like how do you physically manage that element of it?
Yeah, so usually I have everybody email me by the night before I harvest, and then I literally just tally up all the orders on a sheet of paper, and I usually just do it by hand. I have worked with Excel a little bit on spreadsheets. I've done a little bit of both, but right now, currently, I'm just kind of going by hand right now, the orders going down the list, and then I just go out to the field and I harvest the exact amount that came in on the order. And I think what's cool about my CSA is that I always harvest in the morning and my deliveries are in the evening. So I'm harvesting the order exactly, and I'm getting everything to the person who's going to be eating it that same exact day. And so, I mean, it's hard for even like a farmer's market to compete with that, because a lot of times the food at a farmer's market was picked the day before, or maybe the day before that. I think it's pretty rare to get food the exact day it's coming out of the ground. So.
Yeah, that's neat. I'm curious now, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into farming?
Yeah, so I originally, as a kid or just growing up, I really had no interest in it at all. Both of my grandpas were farmers. My grandpa on my mom's side was a full-time chicken rancher, like I mentioned earlier, and on my dad's side, my grandpa grew up in Nebraska, and he was a wheat farmer out there. But he moved to San Diego and had stopped farming by the time I was around. But I had always heard stories about Nebraska, and that was kind of cool, but never really thought I would be doing it. I actually went to San Diego State, and I got a degree in business finance. And I was working in the field at the time that I started to develop an interest in farming. And really that started because my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer, and I became very interested in health through that process. I started researching like why people get cancer. I was really trying to help my grandpa out, but through that process really discovered, how important it is for people to nourish their bodies with, real food that's grown in healthy soils. And yeah, through that, I actually decided to go back and get certified as a health coach. I wasn't too happy with my finance job. I was sitting in an office every day with a tie, got to shave every day, and it just wasn't super fulfilling. It wasn't really feeling like it was my passion in life, and so I decided to go the health coaching route. And then while I was doing that, I decided to build a little home garden. I was still living with my parents at the time. I was in my early 20s, and really through building that garden, I just fell in love with growing food and started getting these crazy ideas in my head, like, hey, I think maybe it'd be cool if I could just grow a ton of carrots and just try to sell them to people. And so one thing kind of led to the next, and my uncle, like I mentioned earlier, I had access to a little bit of family land, and so one thing led to the next, and I just started growing stuff on my former grandpa's egg ranch.
That's neat. How long ago was that?
So this was 8 years ago that I started my farm. And it started as a weekend project. I was still working full time, and I would just go Saturday, Sunday, and just go hard all day, just building it at the very beginning. And yeah, it was a lot of work. I mean, it was full time, working 2 jobs, and trying to build a business. So it was a pretty interesting time.
Yeah, I imagine. So I want to get into some of your methods in terms of your no-till methods. Can you talk about maybe some of those early years and how you originally set up your garden?
Yeah. So the very early years, when we first developed that alleyway in between the 2 buildings, it was really more of like just like a home garden setup. I literally built these wooden raised beds out of redwood, and they had vertical trellises. I was very much influenced actually by, in the beginning, I had read a lot of square foot gardening and vertical gardening, and so I was really just trying to max out the space that I had, grow as many crops as I could, and be as efficient as possible. And then from there, it just kind of kept growing, and I started reading more. I started going to the farmers markets and talking to other farmers and picking their brains. And originally, I actually did buy a BCS walking tractor. I had a really old model from a farmer friend of mine. It was his old walking tractor. And it never really, it worked, but it broke down on me a lot, and I kind of got tired of fixing it. And so early on, I was thinking, man, how can I get around not having to have a tractor? And I think that was part of it, but also the focus for me has always been on soil health. And so the more I read and the more I focused on how do I build healthy soil, I inevitably just realized that I need to be as non-interventionist with the soil as possible and least disruptive as possible. And so from very early on, I think I used the tiller maybe for the first half a year on some of the first beds that I built. But really, I got away from it very early on and adapted. Instead, I bought a nice broad fork. I got one of those nice big metal 14-inch tine meadow creatures. And man, that thing still looks exactly the same way it did as when I bought it 7 years ago. It's just like a machine. I think it'll probably last longer than me. It's super well built. So yeah, I think for me it was just trying to get away from having to buy or maintain an expensive tractor, and also at the same time just really trying to ultimately maximize the health of my soil, because I think ultimately we can't have healthy minds, healthy bodies without food coming out of a healthy soil. I mean, that's the foundation of everything. So I think it's really important.
I completely agree. So you bought that broad fork, and then how did you transition to away from the tiller? Like what specifically were you doing?
Yeah. So the beds that I built, they were always from the start usually like a layered lasagna bed. But some of the first beds, I actually went in and we dug down maybe like a foot in the native soil and then just dumped in a bunch of compost that we had made on site. But from then, those were permanent beds, and initially I had ran the tiller through it a couple times, but then once I switched to the broad fork, really what I do is I just usually use the broad fork once a year, maybe twice depending on how the bed's looking, or if it's like a crop that I really want to loosen it, maybe like for carrots or something, if I really want to get some good penetration down into there, maybe I'll use it more than once a year. But typically, the broad forks really just once a year, and then most of the time my maintenance is done with a walking hoe, and I just go through the bed briefly and just loosen the very first inch or two of soil, just enough for it to receive the seeds really well for a direct sow, or if I'm transplanting, it's loose enough just to stick them in real nicely for that too.
Okay, so can you describe, you mentioned lasagna gardening. Can you describe for people who don't know what that is and what your process is for setting that up?
Yeah. So I know it's different for everybody. Everybody kind of has different ingredients that they like to use. And I think a lot of times it depends on your budget or what you have access to. For me, I've always had a lot of good access to straw and compost. So for me, I've always just had a very basic lasagna design. I would always start with the very bottom layer as straw, and that would usually be I usually shoot for about 2 to 3 inches on each layer. But I would start with straw, and then I would put a layer of compost on top of that, another 2 to 3 inches. And then on top of that compost, I would put another layer of straw. And then on top of that layer of straw, I would put another layer of compost. And during this whole process, as you're laying down the layers, you're getting moisture on each layer too. So because if you wait till the end to just put moisture on it, it doesn't penetrate as well. So it's good every layer just to get nice, even moisture on there. And then typically, once I do that second layer of compost on the very top, I direct sow cover crop directly into that. And, from what I've read and who I've talked to, I mean, ideally, it's good to cover crop for, as long as you can. I think some guys like to do it up to like a year, but usually I just cover crop for maybe 3 to 4 months, maybe up to 6 months, depending on the time of year and all that. Once the cover crop's looking like it's mature and it's going to start trying to seed, I'll go in with the scythe and I'll cut it at ground level and just let it all that vegetation fall back down onto the bed. And then I let that layer dry out and just kind of lay there on the bed for a week or two. And then typically I come in with another just small layer of compost on that once it's been broken down for a week or two, and just spread the compost real thin over that. And then the bed for me is essentially ready. That's when I would start planting my annual crops, any kind of vegetables or herbs or fruit that I'm trying to do. But I know some guys, they don't even bother with putting compost on the very top layer. I think a lot of guys, they just transplant directly into the cover crop. But I usually add compost. I've had pretty good results with that, especially for direct sowing. In particular because I use a garden waste seeder, and having a seeder when you have that little layer of soil there, it really helps the seeder operate a little better. Well, that's what I've found, at least.
Hey, you all, just going to jump in here real quick and say that if you've been eyeing the Neversink Farm course and you've been wanting to support the show, you can do both at the same time. Connor Crickmore is a supporter of the podcast and will kick a few bucks back to the show if you use our link to sign up for his course. Jackson and I have seen inside of this thing. There is so much great info there on everything from greenhouse production to soil management, talk specifically about tomatoes in the tunnels, all sorts of stuff. It's amazing. He also offers discounts to various tool suppliers for members of the course, including Neversink's tools. And they have some awesome tools. I'm a personal fan of the gritter. Anyway, really inspiring stuff. I will put the link in the show notes or go to no-tillgrowers.com and find it there. That's right. Sign up for his course. He kicks a few bucks back to the show. Okay, back to Jared.
Okay, so then it takes you a little while to get those beds set up, but then how often are you refreshing those beds with more fertility, more compost?
Yeah, so I'll grow a crop in that bed, and basically my routine is every time I harvest a bed and it's completely done, I'll go in and whatever residual is left from the crop, I take out and we compost on site. So I just turn everything back into soil. So all the leftover material goes to the compost pile, and you're just left with a bare bed with more or less just soil. There might be a little bit of leaves or organic matter left. But from there, I usually just grab some fresh compost. It's already ready to go compost. And I'll put a thin layer on the bed. And then I just work it in very gently with the walking hoe. I just go around the bed just once. And then I rake it flat and replant into it. And sometimes I do that the very same day that I harvested. Sometimes I do it the day after. Sometimes it's a week after. But my production is very, what's the word I'm looking for? We're always planting. So if something comes out and we literally stick something back in the ground, as soon as we try to get something in the ground as soon as we can after harvesting, just to maximize our beds.
Are you bringing in a lot of compost are you buying in a lot of compost?
Yeah, so I probably buy about half of what I use at the farm, and we probably produce and make about half. So it's probably about 50-50 at this point. But we do have a really good soil guy, and he's been making compost since the 70s. He's got it totally dialed in, and he's making really good stuff with a blend of chicken and rabbit manure mixed with browns, and I've always had super good results with that. So yeah, I do supplement with that, but we definitely make a ton of compost ourselves. So, all the scraps on the farm, we're turning back into soil. And the valley that we're in is full of horses, so we get a lot of stable bedding, a lot of straw, and we have access to different manures. We have horse manure, there's cows around, we get cow manure. I have a personal flock of chickens, and so I use chicken manure in there. We just kind of throw in whatever we can, like even cardboard boxes, anything that's biodegradable we'll throw in there. And yeah, I think that's important. If you have the space, it really helps reduce your input costs of having to rely on having to buy so much. I mean, it'd be great if we could just make our own completely someday. But I think I'd probably need to get a little bit more space dedicated to making compost, and probably some more chickens or some more animals to produce our own manure, because we're kind of reliant on other manures and from like farms around us and stuff.
Yeah, so what what is your sort of composting process?
So we have it's an old John Deere. I think it's like a 1450 or 1400 or something like that. And I usually just pile everything up, and I try to do it to where it's pretty balanced. Like I don't want it to be too much of one thing, and I don't get too ridiculous with it. It's always really just by eye, but I'm trying to have a good ratio of browns to the manure that I'm adding in, and usually I think I'll try to pile up at least about 10 yards worth of material, up to 20 to 30 yards. Usually our compost piles are around probably like 15 to 30 yards. And we'll get the whole pile wet. And then once it's wet and starting to, you get the microbes starting to eat everything, I'll go in with our tractor and I'll flip the pile at least once a week, sometimes twice. Depends how busy I am. I always flip it at least once a week, and then I'll do that for usually 5 or 6 months. I kind of do like a slower, just a slower burn. I know a lot of guys, they'll turn their piles and have it done in a few months, but I've always just really liked to slow burn it and make sure everything's just really breaking down and not rush the process too much.
Sure. And then maybe you mentioned this, but are you certified organic?
No, I'm not certified. I, from the beginning, I've never used pesticides. I've never used synthetic fertilizer. I've always been a holistic guy from day one. But I've never been interested in getting certified because for me, it just seemed like it was an additional cost. And I've also been concerned with the organic standard in general. I think it's definitely been slipping over the years, especially recently. I don't know, you probably are familiar with it, but they're now allowing hydroponic growing under the organic certification, which I find issue with. And for me, I think since I'm dealing directly with my customers and the people who are eating my food, for me, instead of getting certified, it's always been more powerful that they just know me as the farmer, and they're always invited out to the farm, and I will give them a tour and show them how I do things. And I think for my customers, that's always been something that's super powerful and maybe even better than, buying something at a store that has a little sticker on it that, gives you a guarantee supposedly. But I think it's more powerful to actually know the farmer, actually know where the food's coming from, and to be buying it locally from somebody in your own neighborhood.
I often think about when you're a CSA farm or you're going directly to the consumer, that you are the label, and it's less necessary to have the organic certification. It helps in certain situations if you're doing wholesale or if you're doing even farmers market. But the direct to consumer thing it's great because you become the label for your farm, the spokesman.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe it makes sense more on a wholesale level or in different situations. But for me, just dealing direct to the consumer, it's always been great. Just kind of doing it the way that I have been.
Yeah, that's cool. Can you tell us? You and I talked before we started recording about some of your sort of fruit trees and how you're managing that amongst your vegetables.
Yeah, definitely. So when I first started the farm, I was greatly influenced by Elliot Coleman and guys like J.M. Fortier, and just really it was a market garden based on that style. And over the years, I started reading more about agroforestry and permaculture as well, and started reading more like Mark Shepard and Jeff Lawton, Bill Mollison, Toby Hemingway, and just different guys that were incorporating a lot of perennials into the landscape. And for me too, it was an approach that I was trying to figure out better pest control strategies and how to bring more balance to my site. And I think through that, I really became interested in trying to plant as many as much diversity as possible. And so really what I started doing is I had these permanent beds already laid out, and so I would just go and basically every 10th bed I would turn it into a hedgerow and plant, as the dominant species, I would plant fruit trees. But then in the understory, I would plant a multitude of different herbs and flowers. And so this had the effect of bringing a lot more diversity to the landscape. And it was, all the flowers and the different herbs, they're attracting in beneficials. And so it's cool because it gave me more crops to offer my customers. But at the same time, it also provided a better pest control strategy for me, because now my site was much more balanced. Instead of just having all these annuals growing, I had perennials and much more of a balance of insects. So there's much more predators coming in, and a lot more, I for one really noticed more ladybugs once I had more flowers, more hoverflies. All the guys that are going to be going after the stuff that's trying to eat my crops. So yeah, I think that was really a good direction to take it. I think I think maybe even Elliot Coleman talks about putting in flowers too, but I don't know if it's in the same style as doing the actual hedgerows like I'm doing. I know recently J.M. Fortier, I think he is actually doing more of that style now too on one of his new sites. So it's kind of interesting to see the evolution of the market garden and how we can make it even more efficient, more diverse, more resilient against pests. So I think it's really cool. It's kind of this wide open thing right now. People are experimenting with different perennials that work together, different guilds and companion planting. And, there's not a whole lot of research on that. So it's kind of cool to be able to experiment with that and see what works. I think that's definitely something going forward that could benefit a lot of small farms.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny. It's almost like, permaculture kind of got put on the back burner for a lot of farmers because they realized they needed to make money. And a lot of times the design of permaculture isn't always, didn't always emphasize that. So it's kind of cool to see this sort of resurgence of people who are taking more of those principles and bringing them back into the market garden.
Yeah, definitely. Completely, yeah. I think that's kind of been one of the downfalls of permaculture, is the sense that people don't think that it's something that you can really make a living doing, and it's not reasonable in that regard. But yeah, like you said, if you kind of hybridize the two and take what's beneficial from permaculture and we kind of mix it with the market garden, there's things that match up pretty good. And I think we can, maybe this is the next step forward, that we can make our market gardens all, that much better by implementing these ideas.
Are you running, I know you don't lack for sunshine down there in San Diego, but are you having issues, or do you foresee having issues with shade from those trees?
Yeah. Well, actually, that's one of the reasons I planted them as well. Here in San Diego, especially in East County where I'm at, summertime just gets brutal. We get up to 100 degrees, sometimes up to 105. Not every day, but if you're trying to grow like leafy greens or even like peppers, they just get beat up out there real bad. And so for me, I've been kind of resistant to buying a lot of plastic. I really don't want to use a lot of shade cloth. I do use some. But for me, the long-term approach with these trees is that once they get bigger, and the trees that I planted, they're apple trees and they're stone fruit and pomegranates. So they're all trees that lose their leaves in the wintertime. So in the wintertime, the field just opens up. There's no shade from the trees at all. And then in the summertime, when the leaves are on the trees, that's going to help me be able to grow certain leafy greens and certain cool season crops that normally I wouldn't be able to do that if I just had a wide open field and I just stuck them in the ground. They just fry. But once these trees are big and they provide that shade, I'm going to be able to grow lettuce hopefully year round. That's what I'm hoping. It's not quite there yet. The trees, most of them are about 4 to 5 years old, so they're not super huge yet. But I'm hoping that that's what it turns into, is that it helps me to be able to grow more variety year round where I couldn't before.
I love that idea of using, the trees, the shade from the trees as a sort of shade cloth. And I love that idea in general of just having a crop do what we often, a crop, or in this case, a perennial tree, do what we often do with things like shade cloth. And yeah, my wife and I experimented with that a little bit this summer in growing, planting lettuce underneath fairly mature celery to allow the celery to give it that 2 weeks of shade it needs in the middle of the summer. And it worked really well. And I love that idea of implementing some sort of perennial to help you with that. So are you guys growing year round then?
Yeah, San Diego, we can always grow something. For us, it's really just a matter of what we grow. So there's basically 2 seasons here. We have the warm season and the cool season. And in the warm season, we do all the summer crops, like tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers, and then and a lot more stuff than that. But during the cool season, it really switches more to the leafy greens and some of the brassicas. But definitely, we're always doing root crops year round. We always have carrots going. We always have beets. We usually have lettuce going. I think for us, in the past couple years, I've kind of planned my crops to be done by September, because September here is like the most brutal hot month usually, like August, September. And I've kind of found that even if I plant stuff and try to have it ready during that time, it's usually kind of beat up and not really at its optimal point that I would want it to be. And so I've actually used September and the end of August and September as kind of like my winter. And I would close down the farm for maybe a month and a half and just try to get away, maybe take a little bit of time off, and also use that time to turn over a lot of the summer beds and convert them over to the beginning of the winter crops. But if you're hardcore and you want to, you can literally grow year-round in San Diego.
Yeah, that sounds kind of attractive in many ways. I like having a little break in the wintertime, but I'm already itching for spring.
Yeah, I bet.
I want to hear a little bit about your expansion. I know you guys are expanding. How are you sort of going about that in terms of setting up a new garden?
Yeah. So, I was approached by a local dairy, and they actually have kind of been bleeding out over the past couple years, not making too much money. I think the price of milk has really dropped. And they had recently decided to sell most of their herd, and they approached me because they wanted to basically keep their farm running, and they're trying to figure out ways forward that they can make this work. And they're very much connected with a lot of local schools, and they do farm tours over there. And so the idea is that I'm going in there and I'm building out a full-blown market garden, but in the same style as my original site. So it's going to be very much a perennial style, permaculture influenced market garden. And once it's done, we're going to be offering tours to the local community, to different elementary and junior high schools, and also just the families, to anybody who wants to come out and see, how food is grown. And, I think a lot of people are disconnected from that now, and so it's kind of a cool thing for people to be able to see that. But yeah, we're building that site in very much the same way that I built the original site. So we're going in and we're putting in lasagna beds, and we're building that with just the basic recipe that I described earlier. I'm just doing the straw compost with a layer of cover crop on top of that, and then with just a thin layer of compost on top of that. And yeah, over there, I'm putting in the hedgerows every 10 beds. So, and I'm doing 4-foot beds. So yeah, there's about, 9 beds in between each tree line. And that may change over time. As the trees get bigger, we may take the beds that are closest to the trees out, so there's more space. But it's going to be a while before that happens. So in the meantime, in the next 5 years, I'm just going to keep growing stuff right up next to the trees until it perhaps gets to that point. But yeah, it's very much in the same style as the original site.
Okay, yeah, that's so interesting. And you feel like, my impulse here is to, when I'm thinking about that amount of material and input, that it would be a fair expense for, how big did you say this plot was?
Well, they offered me up to 2 acres. I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing the full lot, but at the moment it's just shy of probably a half acre right now. And you're right, it is a bit of material. Now, I'm lucky, I guess, in that regard, because I know one of my neighbors at my original site is a guy who has a trucking company, and he hauls stable bedding and different manures. And so I usually have access to a lot of that material for very cheap through him. Sometimes even free. He just hooks me up because he has too much. But yeah, maybe that would be an issue for somebody trying to do it on a larger scale to source that much material. That could be an issue. But again, you could just do maybe not as thick layers. Maybe just go down to like an inch or 2 per layer if you have less material. Or perhaps you don't do as many layers. You just do maybe a straw compost and plant into that, or maybe just straw and compost and plant into that. I think it's pretty flexible. The way that I do it, I don't think by any means is like the right way. I think there's definitely different ways to do it, and that's what's cool about farming, is that people have success with a lot of different things, and it's cool to hear what works for people and kind of bounce ideas around.
Yeah, I agree, and that idea of that is sort of the materials that you listed are sort of the materials you have access to. And one of the cool things in terms of like the conversations I've had is that a lot of people develop their sort of no-till system just based around what's around them, because we can't all order in the best compost, or maybe cover crops makes the most sense for our scale, or in your case, you have access to all this material. I think that's really cool, and that's a really good way of using it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, is working with what's around you and what you have access to. Because otherwise, yeah, if you're like set on one type of material, perhaps you're going to end up spending a lot of money on that. It's better just to figure out what's free around you and what you can use for as cheap as possible.
Well, Jared Smith, I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, me too. It's been good. Really appreciate the call.
All right, we're going to post a video this week at no-tillgrowers.com that Stephen Cornett did with Jared where they talk about his farm. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast, give it some stars, write a review, all those good things. Also consider the Patreon page. That's patreon.com/farmerjesse. Like I said, need to get that up to $1,000 a month to be able to afford a second season. Patreon is simply a site where patrons go to patron. So check that out. You can also Venmo us a donation or however you prefer to support the show. Also check out Neversink Course. That link will be in the show notes. Big shout out to this week's sponsors, Groan for Market Magazine and Banner Greenhouses. Check them out. Banner's stuff is really amazing, and Growing for Market is an essential tool for any market gardener. That magazine is extremely helpful. Otherwise, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.
I think a lot of people will be excited to hear. I don't know that I really did it justice, but this idea that, like, permaculture is kind of, people are over it, and they're like, yeah, it's not a thing. Like, it's like homesteading. It's not a viable business. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful idea, but it's a concept. It's a theory. It's not a viable business. But I love that there's so many market gardeners who are being like, well, hold on.